All right, and welcome to another video and another final review. So these have been a lot of fun to do. I have been keeping a lot of these knives in my pockets as my primary knives over the last few weeks, and I'm finally ready to talk about some of my final thoughts. So today, let's talk about the Custom Knife Factory Evo 2. This knife is a release between CKF and Rotten Designs. A very, very well designed cleaver Warncliffe flipper. You can see here we've got a really nice exaggerated kind of cleaver blade with a beautiful hollow grind, nice titanium scales, and just a beast of a knife. I know the camera's not really doing it justice because this is a hefty guy. Beautiful, beautiful knife. So, in typical fashion, let's go right in to the fit and finish. So, the scales are titanium scales. They've got titanium hardware, and the scales have a beautiful brushed texture. So they've got all of these lines that go parallel with the length of the scale. Kind of looks like somebody used a wire wheel or something like that on the knife scales to kind of make a little bit of a bark texture on there that gives you a nice haptic feel, gives a tiny bit of grip, a little bit of a sensation as you kind of have a hold of the knife, and just gives a little bit of resistance in there, especially when your hands are sweaty or muddy, anything like that when you're working. One really neat design aspect that I really, really like is that the bark texture on the scales also goes into the flats of the blade. So again, not sure if it comes up, but you can see these lines going down the length of the blade, and then as you go down the flat right here, that bark texture matches. So you kind of have perpendicular lines on the blade where the scale lines go straight into the flats, and then the belt satin lines come down the grind. It's really appealing to the eyes to look at, where you have these kind of complex grind lines where you have the lines coming this way and the lines coming this way. On the swedge on this back side, they're also going up and down at a slightly different angle. So it just kind of draws the eye into a bunch of different planes and makes you kind of take the knife in a little bit more of a degree. Turn my light there just a little bit. The finish of this knife is very, very wear resistant. So you'll probably notice that from my last video, I've got the same shirt because I am recording a couple videos. This is the only day this week that I have any modicum of time to do videos, so I'm trying to cram them all into this one day. You'll probably remember from my other review where I was talking about the Koenig Arius, talking about it having a really wear-resistant fit and finish, and the like kind of acid-washed looking, stone-washed finish on this, mixed with that bark texture, has really made this knife very, very wear-resistant. So I have not had any issues with this showing a lot of wear. I do have just a couple of minor scratches on the scales, and a couple of minor scratches on the clip, just from brushing up against things, getting in and out of crawl spaces and attics, but no actual damage to talk about. So scales have held up very, very well in a fit and finish manner. Just like the Arius, we do have a bit of a fingerprint issue. And again, there we can see a little bit of that smudging on the blade where the oils from my fingers have kind of put little smudge marks on there. Again, if you're using this as a primary knife, you're cutting things, you're cleaning your fingernails, you're doing whatever it is that you do with your EDC knife, smudges aren't a big deal. So, you know, you can always wash them off. You can I sometimes use my handkerchief to clean my knife blade. You can get rid of those. pretty easily. So outside of that, the finish, that's about it. I talked about a little bit of this in the early impressions, talking about the look of the knife overall. It's very aesthetically pleasing. It looks great to the eye. The cleaver design is something that you don't see all the time, you know, so you may be looking at some of those old like Medford knives and some of those like crazy big cleavers. This is kind of a dulled down version of that, where this is actually a practical EDC knife, and this cleaver Wharncliffe blade is actually very functional. So let's go from fit and finish into ergonomics. So ergonomics of this knife are phenomenal. If you want to come back on these scales, this nice heavy jimping up here gives a nice spot for your thumb, kind of elongates your hand to prevent any kind of cramping if you're doing any long-term tasks with this. Or you have the option with this little forward choil to really choke up on the knife, and again, keeps your hand out there pretty nice and flat. But this is a wonderful grip, and this is where I tend to use this knife, is in this exact location. Again, if you're doing a push cut, this knife does absolutely phenomenal. So you're stabbing down, you're pushing through something. This gives a nice spot, jimped spot to put your thumb, where you can really get some good torque, good handle, good grip on this knife. But again, I'm never using my knife in that manner. And then the same thing with the draw cut. I actually hate the grip with this knife when it comes to the draw cut. Everything just feels out of whack. The meat of the bottom side of my hand wants to come in contact with the sharp spot on the back of the blade right up against that forward choil. It's not very comfortable for me for a draw cut, but I would say that I've got a little bit larger than average hands. To take another cue from my buddy Jake, my hands fit in extra large gloves and fill them out pretty well. So I do feel like this knife fits very well in a traditional grip with my hands, but that draw grip, I tend to get a little bit of blade action there with the meat on the bottom of my palm. Again, I never use my knife in that way. The jimping. So the jimping is something that I have seen a few people complain about. This jimping is hefty. There are big cutouts on the back of this blade, on the back spacer. It looks like some saw teeth out of a 1950s sawmill, but they are not sharp. So CKF has beautifully, or Rotten, along with CKF, have beautifully designed these areas of jimping where there's not really any sharp areas. Everything is chamfered beautifully where the chamfer meet. So you have these square patterns on the jimping. Where the chamfers meet together, there actually isn't a sharp point like there is on a lot of other knives. And I don't happen to have an example of that sitting on my desk right now. But the chamfers were done very well. The backside, or the spine of the knife, was chamfered. So this chamfer line goes through the jimping and then through the scales and all the way around. The only areas that are not chamfered are the very forward part of this choil and up here at the tip of the knife. So moving on from that, and something that I welcome that is different than the Arius and kind of puts this knife a little bit ahead of the Arius in this aspect, is the lock bar. So the lock bar on this does have the jimping so that you can get a nice, good grip on it, but it does have a chamfered area right there. So when your thumb hits that spot, it is an absolute dream. So this knife is very fidget friendly. Thumb flick, middle finger flick, and because of the weak detent, you can even just kind of flick it out there with the force of gravity. And opening and closing this knife is an absolute dream because of that tiny little chamfer on there. It relieves all the stress, all of that little irritation factor from the lock bar of the knife, which makes it perform absolutely beautifully. So, all done with the ergos. Let's move on to use. So, as I mentioned before, this is a Wharncliffe cleaver. You don't see it very often. You have a pretty intense hollow grind on this knife, a beautiful, let's see if we can get it here, beautiful thin tip. So you can see that tip is nice and stabby, and then that hollow grind comes up both sides, really thinning out right behind that tip and then thickening up. So when it comes to stabbing things with this knife, this much of the tip is incredibly useful. It's very, very thin. It is very, very stabby, but once you meet the point where my fingers are, that blade gets thick, and it gets thick fast. I notice a lot when I'm using this. So I open a lot of small packages. So like I've got my multivitamins here. They do have a little pull tab, but I'm incredibly addicted to using my knives. So I like to use my knife and slice it open instead of ripping it open. Just one more excuse to take the knife out and cut something. I've noticed a lot with this CKF Evo, if you keep just this area of the tip in whatever it is that you're cutting, it will do just fine. It cuts through it like a razor blade, just knife through butter. If you try to over penetrate, if you try to get in more than just the tip, it tends to bind just a little bit. So you get a lot of thickening as it comes into the spine of the knife right here. And if you kind of cut into a cardboard box and you meet this point, you meet a lot of resistance. And I find a lot of times that the material there will tear or you'll kind of push. If you ever had a cardboard box, you're using a dull knife, you'll kind of get that initial cut. And then all of a sudden the cardboard just starts ripping because your knife is duller than a butter knife. I kind of get that same thing with this. So even though the knife is impeccably great at cutting, the backside of this blade stock is so thick, especially around the tip, that it tends to get a little bit of a bind. That being said, sorry, my cue card fell. That being said, I think that the knife is a wonderful cutter. I don't very often say this because I've got a lot of really nice professional chef's knife in my kitchen upstairs, so I don't typically pull my EDC blades out for food prep, but because this was a cleaver, I thought it's kind of fitting to use that in this way. So I did do some mild food prep, clean the knife off, cut some vegetables, cut up some steak after it was done smoking on the smoker, and this knife does incredibly well for use with food. So if you're the type of person that wants to pull out your mid to high end pocket knife when you're out at a restaurant, freak a few people out, and then cut your steak in the middle of, well, I guess they're not crowded anymore because of COVID. But if you're that type of person that likes to use your knife for food, this one does absolutely phenomenal with that. With these cutouts and the nice belly on the blade, anything that you are cutting food-wise on a cutting board, much like a professional chef's knives, your fingers are up and out of the way. And I'm not saying that you should be holding the back of this and chopping up your cilantro when you're cooking tacos for Taco Tuesday. This does work very, very well in the way of an EDC blade being used for food prep. We talked about the spine thickening. Let's get into really my biggest pet peeve about this knife. Before we do that, clip functions very well, very, very simple. No issues getting in and out of pocket. CKF didn't put any kind of junk in the way so that stuff kind of doesn't go in and out of the pocket well. Clip, fantastic. Let's get into the big gripe. This is a giant Weehaw bit. This is a T20. Now, a lot of you in the knife community are going, T20? I didn't know they even made that big. And that's a joke. I'm not saying that anybody's dumb and doesn't know that a T20 exists, because they make much, much bigger than that. But when we are talking about standard knives, T10 is about the biggest that we're going to get. T8 is probably the average, and T6 is still very, very common. Here we have a T10 and a T20. So most of the hardware on this knife is T8. So if you were taking apart the scales or anything else, you're using a T8 bit. So clip, scales, everything on this knife is T8 until you get to the pivot, which is T20. T20. What? I could have sworn that somewhere I read that the pivot was T15, and I still had not taken the knife apart. But I pulled out my brand new Weehaw bits. Not sure if it'll focus up enough to see that. Nope. Anyways, trust me, it's a T20. And there it is. Nice and snug. No movement. I tried a T15 in there, and it had a lot of play. So we've got a T20 pivot and then T8 hardware. I think that is absurd. Number one, having anything other than all T8, or hell, put all T10 on there. I'd be happy with that too. If all of the hardware on the knife matches, I think that's a beautiful thing. I think that's absolutely wonderful. Even if it doesn't match, do T8 hardware on the scales and do a T10 pivot, because most people in the knife community are going to have a T10. A lot of people aren't going to have a T15. A lot of people aren't going to have a T20. So you've just made a knife that if somebody, say the pivot screw loosens up while you're out and about, well, you've got a couple of extra bits because you're a knife guy and you know that your pivot might loosen up. You go in, you grab your bits, and all you have is a T20, and you look at T10 and you look at this thing and you're like, well, I'm throwing a hot dog down a hallway with this knife. It's absurd to have a T20 as the pivot screw on this knife. That's like my only complaint about this whole thing, other than the little bit of thickness, the cutting issues, which I think are just kind of situational. That pivot is absolutely absurd. So, final thoughts. I definitely think that this knife is a buy. So if you like cleaver designs, if you like Wharncliffe, if you just like the look of this knife, I think that this knife is incredibly well made. Tolerances are beautiful. Fit and finish are phenomenal. Blade shape is somewhat unique. I would say you're not going to find a whole bunch of people that are toting around a knife that looks a whole lot like this. So you can definitely have that kind of flash factor, that uniqueness. You can turn a few heads if that's what you want to do. Knife is incredibly fun to fidget with, extremely useful in day-to-day life, but just a couple of problems. That pivot is a little rough, and I think that the blade stock is a little bit thick in a few areas. So, thank you very much for tuning in for the CKF Rotten Evo 2 review. I do have a few other things that are in the pipeline right now. So I've just recently received the Penna pry bar, and boy, do I have some juicy tidbits to talk about with this thing. So this is the first pry bar that has removed the Vero pry from my pockets. We're going to take a couple weeks with this and see how we like it. And the new knife that is about to start gracing my pockets again is this beauty right here, the Olamic Soloist. Absolutely gorgeous, gorgeous knife. So we will have kind of a final thoughts video on this, even though I haven't done an early impressions yet. So thank you guys very much for tuning in, and I will see you next time.